The call came at 3:47 in the morning, and it changed everything I thought I knew about justice, about truth, and about my own brother. I remember the exact moment because I had been staring at the ceiling for hours, unable to sleep, thinking about how mundane my life had become. Detective Kevin McBride, 15 years on the force, decorated twice, respected by my peers, and yet I felt like I was drowning in paperwork and petty crimes that meant nothing to anyone. I was 42 years old, and I had started to wonder if this was all there was going to be. Then my phone rang, and the voice on the other end was one I hadn't heard in almost 2 decades. "Kevin, it's Daniel. Daniel Reeves. You need to come to the old warehouse on Mercer Street. Come alone. And Kevin, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what you're about to see." The line went dead before I could respond. Daniel Reeves. That name hit me like a freight train, pulling me back through years of memories I had tried desperately to bury. Daniel had been my brother Tommy's best friend when we were growing up on the rough side of Chicago. They were inseparable, those two, running the streets together, getting into trouble together, and eventually disappearing together. Tommy vanished 23 years ago. He was 19, I was 18, and our mother never recovered from losing him. She died believing her oldest son had simply abandoned her, run off to start a new life somewhere without so much as a goodbye. The police investigated for a few months, but without any evidence of foul play and with Tommy's history of talking about leaving town, they eventually closed the case. Just another runaway who didn't want to be found. But I never believed it. Tommy wouldn't have left without me. He wouldn't have left without at least trying to explain. We had plans, dreams of getting out of that neighborhood together, of building something better for ourselves. He was my hero, my protector, the one person in my chaotic childhood who made me feel safe. His disappearance was the reason I became a cop. I told myself that someday, somehow, I would find out what happened to him. But years turned into decades, leads dried up, and eventually, even I started to wonder if maybe everyone else had been right. Maybe Tommy had just left. Now, Daniel Reeves was calling me to a warehouse in the middle of the night, apologizing for something I was about to see. I got dressed quickly, my hands shaking as I holstered my service weapon. My wife Sarah stirred in bed, asking where I was going at this hour, and I lied to her for the first time in our 18 years of marriage. I told her it was work, that I'd be back before she woke up. She mumbled something and rolled over, trusting me completely. That trust felt heavy as I walked out the door. If you're watching this right now, I need you to understand something. What I'm about to tell you isn't just a story. It's a confession, a revelation, and a warning all wrapped into one. This is the truth about my brother's case, the truth about the people I thought I knew, and the truth about how far some people will go to bury their sins. If this story matters to you, if you believe that the truth should always come out no matter how painful it is, then I need you to share this with someone else. Subscribe to this channel right now, because what comes next will change how you see everything. And trust me, you don't want to miss a single moment. The drive to Mercer Street took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. The warehouse district was abandoned, a relic of Chicago's industrial past that the city kept promising to renovate but never did. Broken windows stared down at me like hollow eyes as I parked my car and stepped out into the cold night air. Daniel was waiting for me at the entrance, and I almost didn't recognize him. The lanky teenager I remembered had become a broken man, gray-haired and gaunt, with the look of someone who had been running from something for a very long time. "Kevin," he said, his voice cracking. I didn't know who else to call. I couldn't carry this anymore. Not after what happened last week. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my hand instinctively moving toward my weapon. "What is this place? Where have you been for the past 20 years? "Hiding," he said simply. "The same place your brother should have been. The same place he would have been if he hadn't tried to do the right thing." My blood ran cold. "What do you know about Tommy?" Daniel closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, I saw tears streaming down his weathered face. "Everything, Kevin. I know everything. I've known since the night it happened, and I've been living with that guilt every single day since." He led me inside the warehouse, through a maze of rusted machinery and collapsed ceiling beams, until we reached a section of floor that had been cleared away. There, in the dim light of a single work lamp, I saw what Daniel had called me here to find. A grave. A shallow, unmarked grave that had been hidden beneath the concrete floor for over 2 decades. I didn't kill him, Daniel whispered, falling to his knees beside the disturbed earth. I swear to God, Kevin, I didn't kill him. But I helped bury him. I helped them cover it up. And I've been running ever since. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All those years of wondering, of hoping against hope that maybe Tommy was still out there somewhere, living a different life. It all came crashing down around me in that moment. My brother was dead. He had been dead the whole time. And someone I had known, someone who had eaten dinner at our table and laughed with our family, had helped hide his body. Who? I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. Who killed my brother? Daniel looked up at me with an expression of pure anguish, and what he said next shattered my entire world. Your father, Kevin. Your father killed Tommy. And the police captain who closed the case? He helped cover it up. They've been protecting this secret for 23 years. And now they're trying to kill me to make sure it stays buried forever. For a moment, I couldn't process what Daniel had said. The words hung in the air between us, impossible and horrifying, demanding that I choose between everything I thought I knew and this terrible new reality he was presenting. My father, Richard McBride, the man who had raised me, who had taught me how to throw a baseball and change a tire, who had stood proudly at my police academy graduation with tears in his eyes. The man who had comforted my mother when Tommy disappeared, who had spent months searching alongside her, who had aged decades in the years following his oldest son's vanishing. That man had killed Tommy? It was impossible. It had to be impossible. You're lying, I said, my voice cold and hard. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, Daniel, but my father loved Tommy. He loved both of us. He would never. He would, Daniel interrupted, his voice gaining strength despite his tears. He did. I was there, Kevin. I watched it happen. I've relived that night every single time I close my eyes for the past 23 years. Don't you dare stand there and tell me I'm lying when I've given up everything to finally tell you the truth. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to beat him until he took it back, until he admitted that this was some elaborate hoax, some twisted joke that I simply didn't understand. But something in his eyes stopped me. There was no deception there, no malice. Just pain, raw and ancient, the kind of pain that comes from carrying an unbearable weight for far too long. Tell me, I said, my legs suddenly weak. I sank down onto a rusted piece of machinery, feeling like the world was tilting beneath me. Tell me everything. Daniel nodded slowly and began to speak. You remember that Tommy was working at the docks that summer, right? Loading cargo, making decent money for the first time in his life. He was so proud of that job, Kevin. He kept talking about how he was going to save enough to get you both out of the old neighborhood, how he was going to make something of himself. I remembered. Tommy would come home exhausted every night, his hands blistered and his back aching, but there was always a smile on his face. He was finally seeing a future for himself, a way out of the cycle of poverty and violence that had trapped our family for generations. What he didn't tell you, Daniel continued, was what else was happening at those docks. The cargo he was loading? It wasn't all legitimate. The company was a front for one of the biggest drug smuggling operations in the city. And your father, Kevin, your father was right in the middle of it. I shook my head, but Daniel pressed on. Richard McBride wasn't just a factory worker, Kevin. He was a fixer. He made problems disappear for the men who ran that operation. People who asked too many questions, people who threatened to go to the police, your father handled them. And when Tommy found out, when he saw something he wasn't supposed to see, he became a problem too. No, I whispered, but my voice had no conviction left. Tommy came to me the night before he died, Daniel said. He was terrified. He had seen your father meeting with men he recognized from the news, men who had been connected to disappearances all over the city. He had found documents, shipping manifests that proved what was really coming through those docks. He wanted to go to the police, Kevin. He wanted to do the right thing. Daniel's voice broke, and he had to take a moment to compose himself before continuing. I begged him not to. I told him it was too dangerous, that these people would kill him without a second thought. But Tommy wouldn't listen. He said he couldn't live with himself if he stayed silent. He said that being a good man meant doing hard things, even when you were scared. That sounded exactly like my brother. Tommy had always had an overdeveloped sense of justice, a burning need to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. It was one of the things I had admired most about him. What happened? I asked, even though I dreaded the answer. Tommy confronted your father that night. I don't know exactly what was said, but I was waiting outside your house, ready to drive Tommy to the police station as soon as he was done. I heard shouting. I heard your mother screaming. And then I heard a gunshot. Daniel's hands were shaking violently now, his whole body trembling with the memory. I ran inside, and I found Tommy on the kitchen floor. Your father was standing over him with a gun in his hand, and your mother was hysterical, trying to stop the bleeding. But it was too late. Tommy was already gone. Tears were streaming down my face now, but I couldn't feel them. I couldn't feel anything. I was completely numb, suspended in a moment of absolute horror that seemed to stretch into infinity. Your father saw me, Daniel continued. He pointed the gun at me and told me that if I ever said a word to anyone, he would kill me too. He would kill my family. He would make us all disappear just like Tommy was about to disappear. And Kevin, I believed him. I was 18 years old, and I had just watched my best friend die. So when he told me to help him carry the body to his car, I did it. When he told me to help dig a grave in this warehouse, I did it. And when he told me to run and never come back, I ran. I sat in silence for a long moment, my mind racing through memories of my childhood, searching for any sign that my father was capable of what Daniel was describing. And slowly, horribly, pieces began to fall into place. The times my father would disappear for days without explanation. The money that seemed to appear from nowhere when times were tight. The looks that would pass between my parents when certain stories came on the news. The way my father had discouraged me from becoming a cop, had tried everything to push me toward a different career. He hadn't wanted me to become a cop because he was afraid of what I might eventually discover. I spent the rest of that night sitting in my car outside the warehouse, unable to drive home, unable to face my wife with this knowledge burning inside me. Daniel had given me everything he knew, every detail he could remember, every name of every person who had been involved in covering up my brother's murder. The most painful name on that list was Captain William Hartley, my mentor and friend, the man who had taken me under his wing when I first joined the force. He had personally overseen the investigation into Tommy's disappearance, and according to Daniel, he had been paid handsomely to make sure that investigation went nowhere. I had trusted Hartley with my life. I had confided in him about my grief over losing Tommy, about my burning need to find out what had happened to my brother. And all along, he had known. He had looked me in the eyes and lied to me, year after year, protecting the man who had murdered my brother. How could I have been so blind? As the sun began to rise over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed impossibly beautiful given the ugliness I had just learned, I made a decision. I was going to bring my father to justice. I was going to expose everyone who had been involved in covering up Tommy's death. And I was going to do it the right way, building a case so airtight that no amount of money or influence could make it disappear. But first, I needed to verify Daniel's story. As much as my heart told me he was telling the truth, my training as a detective demanded evidence. I couldn't destroy my family based solely on the word of a man who admitted to helping bury my brother's body. I drove to the district morgue and called in a favor from Dr. Elena Vasquez, a forensic anthropologist who owed me for helping clear her brother of a wrongful arrest the previous year. I told her I had found what might be a crime scene, that I needed an unofficial examination before I could involve the department officially. Elena was curious, but didn't ask too many questions. That's what I loved about her. She understood that sometimes the truth needs to be uncovered carefully, protected from those who might want to bury it again. The excavation took most of the day. Daniel stayed to help, driven by a desperate need to finally do something right after decades of running. As Elena carefully removed layer after layer of earth and concrete, I found myself holding my breath, simultaneously hoping to find confirmation of what Daniel had told me and praying that somehow, impossibly, the grave would be empty. It wasn't empty. The remains were skeletal, preserved by the dry conditions beneath the warehouse floor. Elena worked silently, professionally, cataloging everything she found. And when she finally emerged from the grave, her face was pale and her hands were shaking. Male, late teens to early 20s at time of death, she said quietly. Single gunshot wound to the chest, consistent with close-range firing. Based on decomposition and the surrounding materials, I'd estimate time of death at approximately 20 to 25 years ago. She paused, looking at me with deep concern. Kevin, there's something else. The victim had a healed fracture in his left arm, consistent with a childhood injury. And there's a distinctive dental feature, a gap between the front teeth That's him, I interrupted, my voice hollow. That's my brother Tommy. He broke his arm falling out of a tree when we were kids. And he always had that gap in his teeth. He used to whistle through it to annoy me. Elena reached out and squeezed my hand, offering what comfort she could. I'm so sorry, Kevin. I'll run DNA confirmation, but based on everything I'm seeing, I'd say you've finally found your brother. I nodded, unable to speak, and walked away from the grave that had hidden my brother for over 2 decades. The sun was setting now, and I realized I had been gone from home for almost 16 hours. Sarah would be worried. She would want an explanation. But how could I explain any of this? How could I tell my wife that my father was a murderer, that my mother had known and kept silent, that the man who had been like a second father to me had helped cover it all up? Let me ask you something. What would you do if you discovered that everything you believed about your family was a lie? If the people who were supposed to protect you had actually been hiding the darkest secret imaginable? Take a moment and really think about that. Think about how it would feel to have your entire identity shattered in a single night. Leave a comment below and tell me how you think you would react, because I still don't know if I made the right choices in the days that followed. I went home and told Sarah everything. It was the hardest conversation of my life, but I couldn't keep something this monumental from her. She held me while I cried, the first tears I had allowed myself since finding Tommy's grave, and she promised to stand by me no matter what happened next. What are you going to do? She asked when my tears had finally dried. I'm going to build a case, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. I'm going to gather evidence against everyone involved, and then I'm going to bring them all down. My father, Hartley, everyone. They're going to pay for what they did to Tommy. Even if it destroys your family, even if it destroys your career. I looked at my wife, the woman who had loved me for nearly 2 decades, who had given me 2 beautiful children, who had been my anchor through every storm. Tommy deserved better, I said. He deserved a brother who would fight for him. And I'm finally going to be that brother, no matter what it costs me. The next few weeks were a blur of investigation and paranoia. I worked in secret, using every resource I could access without alerting Hartley or anyone else who might be connected to the cover-up. Daniel helped where he could, providing names and dates that I cross-referenced with old records and newspaper archives. What I found was even worse than I had imagined. The operation my father had been involved with wasn't just about drugs. It was a massive criminal enterprise that had its tentacles in everything from human trafficking to money laundering to contract killing. And my father, Richard McBride, the man who had taught me to ride a bike and coached my little league team, had been one of their most effective enforcers. According to the records I was able to piece together, my father had been responsible for at least a dozen disappearances over a 15-year period. Men and women who had threatened the organization's operations, who had refused to pay debts, or who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. They had all been handled by Richard McBride, and they had all been buried in unmarked graves just like my brother. My brother hadn't been killed by some stranger, some faceless criminal who didn't know him. He had been murdered by his own father, a man who had looked into the eyes of his firstborn son and pulled the trigger anyway. I wanted to vomit. I wanted to scream. I wanted to storm into my father's house and demand answers, demand some kind of explanation that would make this all make sense. But I didn't. I stayed focused. I kept building my case. The hardest part was confronting my mother. She was 75 now, frail and suffering from the early stages of dementia that had been slowly stealing her memories for years. But when I sat down with her and asked about the night Tommy disappeared, something in her eyes cleared, and for a moment, she was fully present. I knew you would figure it out eventually, she said. her voice small and broken. You were always the smart one, Kevin. The determined one. I knew you would never stop looking for your brother. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, struggling to keep the anger out of my voice. This woman had held me while I cried for Tommy. She had comforted me through years of grief and uncertainty. And she had known the truth the entire time. Because I was afraid, she admitted, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. Your father said he would kill all of us if we ever talked. He said he would make me watch you die before he killed me. I believed him, Kevin. I had just watched him murder my oldest son without a moment's hesitation. I believed every word he said. So you let me become a cop? I demanded. You let me spend my entire career searching for answers you already had. I hoped you would find peace, she whispered. I hoped you would eventually accept that Tommy was gone and move on with your life. I never wanted you to know the truth. The truth is too horrible for anyone to carry. I sat back, struggling with emotions I couldn't begin to name. Part of me wanted to hate her, to blame her for every moment of pain I had experienced in my search for Tommy. But looking at her now, this fragile woman who had been living in terror for over 2 decades, I couldn't find it in my heart to condemn her. Where is he now? I asked. Where is Dad? He left me 5 years ago, she said, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. After all those years of keeping his secrets, of living in fear, he left me for a woman half his age. He's been living in Florida, spending the money he made from all those years of doing terrible things. He calls me on holidays sometimes, asks if I need anything, as if money could make up for everything he took from us. I took my mother's hand in mine, feeling how thin and fragile her bones had become. I'm going to make him pay for what he did, I said quietly. I'm going to bring him to justice, Mom. I'm going to give Tommy the peace he deserves. She squeezed my hand weakly, and for a moment, I saw something like hope in her faded eyes. Be careful, Kevin. Your father is more dangerous than you know, and he's not working alone. The people who protected him all those years, they're still out there. They're still powerful, and they'll do anything to keep their secrets buried. I promised her I would be careful, but even as I said the words, I knew that careful wouldn't be enough. I was about to take on some of the most powerful people in Chicago, people who had been getting away with murder for decades. Careful wasn't going to cut it. I needed allies. I needed people I could trust absolutely. People who had no connection to the web of corruption that had swallowed my father and Captain Hartley and God knows who else. I started reaching out to old friends, colleagues I had worked with over the years who I knew had clean records and strong moral convictions. Detective Maria Santos was the first to join my cause. We had been rookies together, and she had always been suspicious of the way certain cases seemed to disappear or get quietly resolved. When I laid out what I had discovered, she didn't hesitate. I'm in, she said firmly. I always knew there was something rotten in this department. I just never had the evidence to prove it. Agent Thomas Chin from the FBI was next. He had been investigating organized crime in Chicago for years, always running into dead ends and inexplicable interference from local law enforcement. When I explained the connection to Captain Hartley and the network of protection that had kept my father's organization running, his eyes lit up with the fire of a man who had finally found the missing piece of a puzzle he had been working on for decades. This is it, he said, pacing his office excitedly. This is the key to everything. If we can prove that Hartley was on the take, that the Chicago PD was actively covering for a major criminal organization, we can bring the whole house of cards tumbling down. Together, the three of us began building a case that would ultimately span 2 states and implicate dozens of officials at every level of law enforcement and local government. We worked in secret, trusting no one, knowing that a single leak could get us all killed. And through it all, I kept thinking about Tommy, about the brother who had died trying to do the right thing, about the man he might have become if he had lived, about the life that had been stolen from him by the person who should have protected him more than anyone else in the world. 3 months after Daniel's call, we were ready to move. We had statements, documents, financial records, and most importantly, we had my brother's remains, along with Dr. Vasquez's forensic analysis that proved he had been murdered. But the night before we were set to execute our arrests, everything fell apart. I came home to find my wife and children gone. There was a note on the kitchen table, written in a hand I didn't recognize, with a phone number and a simple message. Call us if you want to see them again. My blood ran cold as I dialed the number, my hands shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. "Kevin," said a voice I recognized instantly. Captain William Hartley, the man I had trusted for 15 years, the man who had covered up my brother's murder. "I really wish you had left this alone. I gave you every opportunity to walk away, to live your life in blissful ignorance. But you just couldn't stop digging, could you? Where's my family?" I demanded, my voice raw with fear and fury. "They're safe. For now. But that can change very quickly, Kevin. You have something I want, and I have something you want. I think we can come to an arrangement that works for both of us. What do you want?" "I want you to destroy everything you've gathered. Every document, every recording, every piece of evidence. I want you to convince your friends at the FBI that this was all a mistake, a misunderstanding based on the ramblings of a mentally ill man. And I want Daniel Reeves. He's been a loose end for far too long." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on me. Everything I had worked for, everything Tommy had died for, could be erased with a single decision. But my wife, my children, they were innocent. They had nothing to do with any of this. "And if I do what you ask," I said slowly, "you'll let them go?" "I give you my word," Hartley said, and the irony of those words from a man who had spent his career breaking every promise he ever made was not lost on me. "I need time," I said. "I need to think. You have 12 hours. At midnight, you'll bring everything to the old warehouse on Mercer Street." "Yes, I know about that place. I've known about it since the night your father put your brother in the ground. You'll bring the evidence, you'll bring Daniel, and you'll come alone. If I see any sign of police or FBI, your family dies. Are we clear?" "We're clear," I said, and the line went dead. I sat in my empty house for an hour, paralyzed by fear and rage and grief. Then I picked up the phone and called Maria Santos. "They have my family," I said, "and I have a plan." The next 12 hours were the most intense of my life. Maria and Tom Chun worked frantically to set up surveillance around the warehouse without alerting anyone connected to Hartley's network. Daniel, despite his terror, agreed to come with me, understanding that this was the only way any of us would ever be free. At 11:45 p.m., I drove to the warehouse with Daniel in the passenger seat and a briefcase full of carefully prepared documents in the back. The originals were safe, hidden in a location that only Maria and Tom knew about. What I was bringing to Hartley was a convincing collection of copies and fabricated materials, designed to buy us time while the real trap closed around him. Hartley was waiting inside with 6 armed men and, most importantly, my wife and children. Sarah was bound to a chair, her face pale but defiant. Our kids, Jake and Emily, were huddled beside her, too terrified to cry. "Daddy!" Emily screamed when she saw me, and it took every ounce of self-control I had not to rush to her immediately. "The evidence," Hartley said, gesturing toward the briefcase. "And Daniel, hand them over." I walked forward slowly, keeping my hands visible, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone in the room could hear it. Daniel followed behind me, his shoulders slumped in resignation. "Let my family go first," I said. "Then you get what you want." Hartley laughed, a cold and humorless sound. "You're not in a position to negotiate, Kevin. Give me the briefcase." I handed it over, watching as one of his men began rifling through the contents. For a long moment, I held my breath, praying that our forgeries would pass inspection. The man nodded to Hartley. "It's all here, sir." Hartley smiled, the expression of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. "Excellent. Now, there's just one more loose end to tie up." He raised his gun and pointed it directly at my chest. "I really am sorry about this, Kevin. You were a good cop. You could have had a brilliant career if you had just learned to look the other way. But some people are too moral for their own good. Just like your brother." Time seemed to slow down as I stared down the barrel of Hartley's gun. In that moment, I thought about Tommy, about how he must have felt in his final seconds, facing down the father who was about to take his life. I thought about Sarah and the kids, about how I had promised to protect them and failed. And then the warehouse exploded with light and sound. FBI tactical teams poured through every entrance, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Hartley's men scattered in confusion, some reaching for their weapons, others raising their hands in surrender. In the chaos, I lunged forward, putting myself between my family and any stray bullets. Hartley tried to run, but Tom Chin was faster. He tackled the captain to the ground, cuffing him with the efficiency born of years of practice. "William Hartley," Tom said, his voice ringing with satisfaction. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, kidnapping, and about 30 other charges we'll be adding once we go through all that evidence Kevin collected. You have the right to remain silent, though I doubt it'll do you much good at this point." I rushed to Sarah and the kids, cutting their bonds with a pocket knife, holding them tighter than I had ever held anyone in my life. "It's over," I whispered into Sarah's hair. "It's finally over." But it wasn't over. Not yet. The arrests that night were just the beginning. Over the following weeks, the case unfolded like a poisonous flower, revealing layers of corruption that shocked even the most cynical observers. Captain Hartley's network extended far beyond what we had initially discovered, implicating judges, politicians, and law enforcement officials across multiple states. And at the center of it all was my father. Richard McBride was arrested in Florida 3 days after Hartley's capture, pulled from his beachfront condo in the middle of the night by a joint FBI-DEA task force. He didn't resist. According to the agents who made the arrest, he almost seemed relieved, as if a weight he had been carrying for decades had finally been lifted. I went to see him in prison the day before his trial began. I'm not sure what I was hoping to find. Answers, maybe. Closure. Some explanation that would make sense of how a man could murder his own son. He looked old, my father. Smaller than I remembered. The commanding presence that had dominated my childhood had faded, replaced by something shrunken and pitiful. "Kevin," he said when I sat down across from him. "I wondered if you would come." "I need to understand," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "I need to know why." "Why, Tommy? He was your son. He loved you." "And I loved him," my father said, his eyes distant. "I loved both of you more than you'll ever know. That's what made it so hard." "Hard," I repeated, incredulous. "You shot him. You buried him in a warehouse and let us spend 23 years wondering what happened. You let Mom die never knowing the truth. How can you sit there and talk about how hard it was?" My father was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I was already dead inside by the time Tommy confronted me. The things I had done, the people I had hurt, there was no coming back from that. When Tommy found out, when he said he was going to the police, I knew it was over. Everything I had built, everything I had done to provide for our family, it would all come crashing down. Your mother would go to prison as an accessory. You would be taken away by child services. Our entire lives would be destroyed. So you chose murder instead? I demanded. You chose to kill your own son rather than face the consequences of your actions. I chose wrong, my father said, and for the first time, I saw tears in his eyes. I've known that every single day since. But in that moment, Kevin, I was so deep in the darkness that I couldn't see any other way. Tommy was going to expose everything. And the people I worked for, they wouldn't have stopped with me. They would have killed all of you. Your mother, you, everyone we loved. I told myself I was protecting the family. I told myself Tommy's sacrifice would save the rest of you. That's not protection, I said, standing up from the table. That's murder. And no amount of justification will ever change that. I walked out of that prison and never looked back. My father was convicted on multiple counts of murder and conspiracy, sentenced to life without parole. He died in prison 4 years later, alone and unmourned. But before I move on from this part of the story, I want to pause and acknowledge something important. Justice isn't always clean. It isn't always satisfying. My father's conviction didn't bring Tommy back. It didn't erase the 23 years of pain and uncertainty. It didn't give my mother back the life she might have had if she hadn't lived in constant fear. But it mattered. It mattered because the truth finally came out. It mattered because the men who had built their careers on corruption and cover-ups were finally held accountable. And it mattered because Tommy's death, which had seemed so senseless for so long, finally had meaning. He died trying to do the right thing. And in the end, his sacrifice helped bring down an entire network of evil that had been poisoning our city for decades. The aftermath of the case brought changes I hadn't anticipated. I was promoted to captain, taking over the position that Hartley had corrupted for so long. The department was undergoing a massive restructuring, with new oversight and accountability measures designed to prevent anything like this from ever happening again. I was part of that change, helping to rebuild an institution that had failed not just my brother, but countless other victims over the years. Maria Santos became my second in command, her dedication and integrity exactly what the department needed in its hour of reckoning. Tom Chun received commendations from the FBI and eventually became the head of the Chicago field office, continuing his fight against organized crime with renewed vigor. And Daniel Reeves? The man who had carried the burden of my brother's secret for over 2 decades? He testified at every trial, facing down the men who had threatened him with a courage that surprised everyone, including himself. When it was all over, when the last conviction was handed down and the last cell door closed, Daniel came to see me at the station. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, looking healthier than he had when I first saw him in that warehouse. "I spent so many years running, so many years hating myself for what I let happen. But you gave me a chance to make it right. You gave me a chance to finally be the friend Tommy deserved. Tommy would be proud of you," I said, and I meant it. He would be proud of both of us. Daniel left Chicago after that, heading to the West Coast to reconnect with a sister he hadn't seen in years. He sent me postcards sometimes, pictures of beaches and mountains, and a life being lived without fear for the first time in decades. But the most meaningful moment came on a quiet Sunday morning, 6 months after my father's conviction. I stood in a small cemetery on the outskirts of Chicago, watching as my brother's remains were finally laid to rest. It wasn't a large ceremony, just me, Sarah, the kids, my mother's ashes in an urn beside the grave, and a handful of people who had been touched by the case. The headstone read simply, "Thomas Andrew McBride, beloved son and brother." His courage changed everything. As I stood there, listening to the minister's words, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over 2 decades. Peace. Not the peace of forgetting or the peace of moving on, but the peace of knowing that the truth had finally been told, that justice had finally been served, that my brother's death had not been in vain. "I found you, Tommy," I whispered as they lowered his casket into the ground, just like I promised. "It took me a long time, but I found you, and I made them pay, every single one of them." Sarah squeezed my hand, and I felt my children pressing close on either side of me. My family, whole and safe, standing beside me as I said goodbye to the brother I had spent my life searching for. That night, I went home and sat in my backyard, looking up at the stars like Tommy and I used to do when we were kids. We would lie on the grass for hours, making up stories about the constellations, dreaming about the futures we would have. Tommy had dreamed of being a firefighter, of saving lives and being a hero. He never got to live that dream, but in a way, he achieved something even greater. His courage, his willingness to stand up against evil even when it cost him everything, had ultimately brought down an empire of corruption that had destroyed countless lives. My brother was a hero after all, just not in the way he had imagined. 5 years have passed since that night in the warehouse. 5 years since I learned the terrible truth about my family. 5 years since I finally brought justice to my brother. I'm not captain anymore. I retired last year, hanging up my badge after 30 years on the force. The department is in good hands now, run by people I trust, people who understand that the law exists to protect everyone, not just the powerful few. I spend my days differently now. I've started a foundation in Tommy's name, providing resources for families of missing persons, helping them navigate the labyrinth of uncertainty that I know all too well. We've helped bring closure to hundreds of families, and every case, every reunion, every answer feels like a continuation of what Tommy started all those years ago. My kids are grown now, following their own paths. Jake became a prosecutor, driven by the same hunger for justice that consumed me for so long. Emily went into social work, helping at-risk youth escape the cycles of poverty and violence that had shaped her father's childhood. They know the whole story. I told them everything when they were old enough to understand, wanting them to learn from the darkness in our family's past rather than be defined by it. They carry Tommy's memory with them, this uncle they never knew, but whose sacrifice shaped their entire lives. Sarah is still by my side, still my anchor, still the person who reminds me every day that there is good in the world worth fighting for. Our marriage is stronger than ever, forged in the fire of those terrible months when everything seemed lost. And sometimes, late at night, I still think about my father. I think about the choices he made, the paths he walked, the darkness he allowed to consume him. I try to understand how a man can lose himself so completely, can become so disconnected from his humanity that he could murder his own child. I don't have answers. I'm not sure anyone does. But what I do know is that every day, we face choices. Small choices and big ones. Choices about who we want to be and what we're willing to accept. My father made his choices, and they led him to destruction. Tommy made different choices, and they led him to death, yes, but also to something greater than himself. I'd like to think I've made the right choices too. I'd like to think that Tommy, wherever he is, would be proud of the man I've become. There's one more thing I need to tell you before I finish this story. Last month, I received a letter from a woman in California. Her name was Maria Hernandez, and she was the daughter of one of my father's victims, a man who had disappeared in 1987, whose case had never been solved. Thanks to the evidence we uncovered during our investigation, Maria finally learned the truth about what happened to her father. His remains were recovered from a location my father had disclosed during his trial, and Maria was able to give him a proper burial after 35 years. Thank you, her letter said. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for fighting for the truth, even when it cost you everything. You gave me my father back. You gave me closure. You gave me peace. I sat in my office for a long time after reading that letter, tears streaming down my face. Because that's what this has all been about from the very beginning. Not just Tommy, not just my family, but all the families who were destroyed by men like my father, all the victims who deserve to be remembered, all the truths that needed to come to light. Tommy's case was the oldest case I ever worked. 23 years of lies and cover-ups and silence. But in the end, the truth came out anyway. The truth always comes out, if you're willing to fight hard enough for it. That's the lesson I want you to take from this story. No matter how deep the darkness seems, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against you, the truth has a way of emerging. And when it does, it can bring redemption, closure, and yes, even victory. Tommy died trying to do the right thing. But because of his sacrifice, because of the chain of events his courage set in motion, justice was finally served. My brother didn't die in vain. He died as a hero, and that's how I choose to remember him. Every year on the anniversary of his death, I visit his grave. I bring flowers, and I tell him about everything that's happened since my last visit. I tell him about his nephew and niece, about the cases his foundation has helped solve, about the lives that have been changed because he refused to stay silent. And every year, I make him the same promise I made all those years ago. I won't forget you, Tommy. I won't let anyone else forget you either. Your story will live on. Your courage will inspire others. And the truth you died for will keep setting people free. That's the end of my story. But it's not really an end, is it? Because stories like this, they continue in everyone who hears them. They plant seeds of courage and determination that grow into something bigger than any one person. So I'm asking you now, if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel so that more stories like this can be told. Because somewhere out there, there's another family searching for answers, another victim waiting for justice, another truth that needs to come to light. And maybe, just maybe, this story will give someone the strength to keep fighting, just like Tommy did. For Tommy, for truth, for justice.